The Little Albert experiment, conducted in 1920 by John B. Watson and his graduate student Rosalie Rayner at Johns Hopkins University, is a very seminal psychological study. However, the experiment is also infamous for its ethical implications and the lack of consideration for the well-being of the subject involved. The experiment centered on an 11-month-old boy referred to as Albert Bikai, or Little Albert. The goal was to investigate whether fear could be induced in a human being through classical conditioning, a theory initially explored by Ivan Pavlov in dogs. Watson and Rayner aimed to demonstrate that emotional responses such as fear, rage, and love could be conditioned through association, challenging the then-dominant belief that such feelings were innate. In the experiment, Little Albert was initially exposed to a white rat, to which he exhibited no fear. Subsequently, whenever Albert reached for the rat, a loud sound was produced by striking a steel bar with a hammer behind his head, leading to a fear response. After several pairings of the rat with the loud noise, Albert began to cry and show signs of fear, merely at the sight of the rat, even in the absence of the noise. This conditioned fear response was later generalized to other furry objects, including a rabbit, a fur coat, and a Santa Claus mask. The experiment was groundbreaking in demonstrating that emotional reactions could be conditioned in humans, contributing significantly to the behaviorist school of psychology. However, it raised severe ethical concerns. Firstly, there was no informed consent from Albert's mother, who was unaware of the experiment's nature. Secondly, the experiment inflicted psychological distress on a child, with no evidence that Watson and Rayner attempted to decondition the induced phobias before Albert left the study, potentially leaving him with a lasting fear of furry objects. The Little Albert experiment's ethical issues have led to it being frequently cited in discussions about the need for ethical standards in psychological research. It serves as a cautionary example of how not to conduct research, especially involving vulnerable populations like children. Despite its contributions to psychology, the experiment is a stark reminder of the importance of considering the welfare and rights of research subjects. The monster study, conducted in 1939 by Wendell Johnson at the University of Iowa, is one of the most controversial experiments in the history of psychology due to its ethically questionable methods and lasting impact on the participants. The study aimed to investigate the cause and effect of stuttering by examining the impact of positive and negative speech therapy on 22 orphan children in Davenport, Iowa. Johnson, who himself was a stutterer, sought to test his theory that stuttering was a learned behavior caused by a child's environment, particularly the anxiety induced by overly critical parents or caregivers. To this end, the children were divided into two groups. One received positive speech therapy where they were praised for their fluency, while the other group received negative speech therapy, in which their speech was belittled, and they were informed that they were stutterers, even if they were not. Mary Tudor, who carried out the experiment under Johnson's supervision, delivered the therapy sessions. The negative therapy had profound effects on the children, many of whom were psychologically harmed by being labeled as stutterers. Some of the children who had not previously exhibited stuttering began to show speech problems after the negative reinforcement. The experiment was dubbed the Monster Study because of the monstrous impact it had on the children's self-esteem and psychological well-being. The study was kept hidden for fear of backlash until it was exposed in 2001, leading to widespread public outrage. The ethical violations of the study are clear. It involved vulnerable children without their consent or that of their guardians. The children were subjected to psychological harm, and there was a lack of debriefing or therapeutic intervention to reverse the damage caused by the experiment. The Monster Study's revelations led to significant changes in ethical standards for psychological research, emphasizing the protection of vulnerable populations and the imperative to do no harm. Despite its ethical shortcomings, the study is often cited in discussions about the etiology of stuttering and the profound impact of negative reinforcement on speech disorders, serving as a cautionary tale about the ethical considerations necessary in psychological research. Project Bluebird, later renamed Project Artichoke, was a covert CIA program initiated in 1951 with the aim of developing mind control techniques that could be used against Soviets during the Cold War. The project emerged out of a context of intense geopolitical rivalry where fears of Soviet brainwashing techniques captured the American military and intelligence imagination, especially following the Korean War and the confessions of American POWs. The primary objective of Project Bluebird Artichoke was to explore the possibilities of controlling an individual's mind, making them divulge secrets against their will, or even control their actions without their knowledge. The methods employed in Project Bluebird Artichoke were diverse and often ethically dubious, aimed at exploring ways to control human behavior and extract information against a person's will. These included administration of psychoactive substances like LSD, barbiturates such as sodium amate and scopolamine to alter mental states and lower inhibitions, making subjects more susceptible to suggestion. Attempting to hypnotize subjects to induce amnesia, extract information, or implant suggestions, exploring the limits of human consciousness and suggestibility. Isolating subjects from sensory input to induce disorientation and vulnerability, making them more open to interrogation and suggestion. Utilizing electrical shocks to erase memories or alter mental states based on the belief that it could break down existing psychological patterns. Employing various forms of physical abuse and psychological manipulation to break down individual resistance and willpower. The project is infamous for its blatant disregard for ethical standards, as many of the experiments were conducted without the informed consent of the subjects, who were often unwitting civilians, military personnel, or government employees. The experiments could have, and in some cases did, lead to long-lasting psychological trauma for the participants, raising profound ethical questions about the extent to which the government can go in the name of national security. The secrecy surrounding Project Bluebird Artichoke and its successors, such as MK-Ultra, has made it difficult to fully understand the extent and outcomes of the experiments. Eventually, this led to the establishment of stricter ethical guidelines for human experimentation, including the right to withdraw without penalty and the need to minimize harm. The Stanford prison experiment, conducted in 1971 by psychologist Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University, stands as one of the most infamous psychological experiments in history, illustrating the profound impact of situational variables on human behavior. The experiment aimed to investigate the psychological effects of perceived power, focusing on the struggle between prisoners and prison officers. Zimbardo transformed the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building into a mock prison and recruited 24 college students to play the roles of both guards and prisoners. The participants were randomly assigned to their roles in a simulated prison environment, with the experiment scheduled to run for 2 weeks. The guards were given uniforms, whistles, and sunglasses to prevent eye contact with the prisoners, while the prisoners wore uncomfortable smocks and caps and had chains placed around their ankles. No physical violence was permitted, but the guards were otherwise given free rein to run the prison as they saw fit. The experiment quickly spiraled out of control as the guards adopted authoritarian measures, subjecting the prisoners to psychological torture, including arbitrary rules, roll calls at odd hours, and solitary confinement in a dark closet. The prisoners, in turn, showed severe emotional distress, with some rebelling, some becoming passively compliant, and others breaking down to the point of being removed from the study. Zimbardo, acting as both the principal investigator and the prison superintendent, became so engrossed in the proceedings that he overlooked the escalating abuse, only halting the experiment after 6 days following objections from colleagues and the intervention of his future wife, psychologist Christina Masloch, who was shocked by the conditions when she visited the prison. The Stanford prison experiment revealed the ease with which ordinary individuals could engage in cruel behavior when placed in a situation that supported authoritarian roles and dehumanized others. It underscored the power of situational forces and institutional environments over individual personalities in shaping behavior. The ethical implications of the experiment were profound, leading to significant changes in how psychological research is conducted, particularly concerning the well-being and informed consent of participants. Despite criticisms regarding its methodological flaws and ethical concerns, the Stanford prison experiment remains a crucial study in social psychology, offering insights into the social dynamics of power, authority, and obedience. The UNABOMBER'S psychological experiment, conducted from 1959 to 1962, refers to a controversial and ethically questionable study that involved Ted Kaczynski, who would later become known as the Unabomber. The experiment took place at Harvard University and was led by psychologist Henry Murray, an expert in stress interrogation techniques. The study aimed to analyze the effects of extreme stress and interpersonal dynamics on individuals, particularly focusing on how they would react under intense psychological pressure. Ted Kaczynski, then a 16-year-old undergraduate at Harvard, was among the 22 participants in this study. The experiment involved a series of stressful and demeaning interrogation sessions where participants were asked to write personal essays discussing their beliefs and aspirations. These essays were then used as material for confrontational and highly personal attacks by interrogators during subsequent sessions, which were conducted under bright lights and with the subject's face filmed for analysis. The participants were hooked up to electrodes to monitor their physiological responses and were subjected to what can only be described as psychological torture intended to provoke and analyze stress reactions. The sessions were extreme, with subjects being subjected to harsh criticism and personal attacks, leading to significant emotional distress. For Kaczynski, who was already socially isolated and emotionally vulnerable, the impact of these experiments was profound. Critics argue that the experiment may have played a role in his later psychological development and subsequent criminal activities, although this remains speculative. The ethical implications of the experiment are significant. Participants, particularly young and impressionable students like Kaczynski, were not fully informed about the nature of the study or the extent of the emotional duress they would be subjected to. There was a clear lack of informed consent, as the true purpose of the experiment was obscured and the potential for harm was significant. Moreover, there was no follow-up care or support provided to the participants after their exposure to such high levels of stress, leaving them to deal with the psychological aftermath on their own. The Unabomber's psychological experiment is often cited as an example of the ethical lapses that can occur in psychological research. It underscores the need to minimize harm and the ethical obligation to debrief and provide support to research participants, especially when studies involve potentially harmful or distressing procedures. Subscribe for more scary videos and press the like button if you enjoyed.